And we continue learning Dirshu Mishnah Berurah. I apologize for the delay in all the shiurim. Hopefully, we will quickly get back on board. So we're middle of Hilchos Netilas Yadaim, a little bit behind the rest of the Dirshu schedule, but we pick it up with Sif Zayin. Says the Mechaber Imshiv Sheif Yadav Zu Bezu. If you rub your hands one into the other, Yizayer, you should be careful. When you're after the Netilas Yadayim, you want to rub your hands together, be careful. Don't touch an area that the water did not touch. Why? Because such an area, of course, is tamei. Zu as zu. And then what it will accomplish is that area will be metamei when you touch it. So it says in the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkatan Nun Hey, Im Shiv Sheif. Hainu, explains the Mishnah Berurah. Even though you listened and you poured a revi'is at one time, or you already poured water twice on both hands, but meaning you basically did what you had to do. The process is done, your hands are tar. If you touch above, then Yitamu b'negiyasan. You touch above, says Mishnah Berurah, chutz mimakom sivkatan unvav. Mayri shenatal amayim rak ad kishrei etzva'isaf. So says Mishnah Berurah, we can be discussing the water only touched the bottom of your fingers, not the back of your hand. As we proved from Yom Kippur, after you know maybe you don't have to wash that area, but it's still tamei. Because for truma you do have to wash there. And therefore, if your hand is wet and you touch that area, it will make it tamei. However, you washed all the way to the wrist like you're supposed to. Then you don't have to worry that you might touch higher on your hand. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why do you not have to be worried about touching higher on your hand? So we turn over the page. Tisham, because over there, ein makaim toma lakol. That's not an area of toma lakol apaiskim. Vida concludes the Mishnah Berurah. You should know. Any area they have to be careful not to touch. From where the water touches. That's only while your hands are wet. Afterwards, when you dry your hands, once you finish drying your hands, you don't have to be worried even about touching that area. Even if they get wet afterwards, no problem. Because your hand already became tamar and you dried it. Before we move on to Sif Ches, there's one Dirshu note over here, note number 41, which we do not have, and therefore let's move on. Says the Mechaber Sif Tes, Natal Yadayachas, you washed one hand. V'shiv sheif b'roish pierce. What does that mean? Kidei lenagva, to dry it. Ulafich lo nitma yadayim masha ein kain. Meaning, you know where to dry your hands, so you wiped it on your face, or your hair, let's say. Says Mishmur, says the Ramah. Now, like we saw that if you scratch your head, we know, then your hand becomes tamei. You rubbed it on a wall. And afterwards you went and you touched that water, the water that's on your head. Again, the water on your hands is tamei. So now if you wipe that hand on the wall, now there's water on the wall. That water is tamei. So if you go and you touch that water, it will be metamei you. Because those waters are tamei and it will be metamei your hands. Even though, says the Mishnah Berurah, as long as you did not rub your hands, mitarim b'shiv shof. Hashta the chazav v'naga gara. If you went back and you touched, it's worse. Again, the Mechaber says once again, and hopefully by now, if you've learned nothing else, it's that to make sure to pour revi'is v'asachas. Says the Mechaber, if you pour revi'is v'asachas, you don't have to worry about this. Te'in shamayim tameim klal, because then the water is not tamei. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkatan nun zayin. Natal yadayachas, after you washed one hand, apirush klal inyan shal sivzeh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'm going to explain what's going on over here. In Mevor Leil B'Sif Beis, we've learned when you wash your hands, you got to pour the first time and the second time. The first one, your hands, then they themselves are tamei. And then the second time you pour does what? Mitaharim oisam, makes those waters tar. If you poured a whole revius, then Rav Paiskim hold you don't need to pour again. Because of kind of Mechaber, and here the Mechaber writes, you pour only one time, and it's less than a revius. Then the water in your hands, so then if you wash them and it's haru yadav, your hand becomes tar. So let's understand what's happening over here. We're for the first time seeing another way to make your hands tar without using a revius and without pouring two times. How? By ridding your hands of the first waters. The first time you pour water in your hands was tamei, becomes tar. The problem is simply that the water on your hands now is tamei. So if you just wipe off that water, now your hand is tar. So says the Mishnah Berurah, as we already explained, that your hand is already tar. And the only issue is going to be if you touch the water, it's going to make your hands tamei. Says the Bir Halacha, this works, but it's all b'diavad. Lechatchila, we want you to pour a second time on your hands. But really what's going on over here, it's really a nice chazara, and really shows exactly how the whole process works. As we see very simply, that the first pouring makes your hands tar, makes the water tamei. Get rid of that water, now your hands are tar. But the water's tamei. You touch that water, now your hands are tamei again. So where do you wipe your hands? There in your head. Because if you touch sweat, then you need to wash again. You're not doing a deep scrub. You're just wiping your hands to dry them off. Like the Rama explains. By wiping off with the water. What does this mean? If you didn't touch that water again, your hands would become tahor without pouring a second time. Because you wiped off those waters. But if you touch the water, it's worse. Now you got to wipe it off because your hands are now tummy. You have to wash again. As we've seen in the previous sifim. Before we call it a day, let's see the Dirshu over here, note number 42. Dirshu says the line of the Mishnah Berurah that Rav Paiskim hold that once you pour revius, it's enough. We've seen in Sivkat Chaf Aleph, even though Rav Paiskim hold pouring one revius, you don't need to pour again. And like the Shulchan Aruch Sasam in Sif Beis, some say you need the second waters, and therefore we said lechatchila you should do such. And at that point, we explained that it was a machlekes Chazon Ish and the Stapler, whether one, the Chayadim was the one that said you should always pour the second waters. The Chazon Ish Lamaisa didn't, the Stapler Lamaisa did. Note number 43 discusses that the Chazon Ish writes, this is the Pashto Shulchan Aruch, it's still a Chiddush, says the Chazon Ish. Because after that's not Paisef Shalita B'Bachas Meravias. But still, Netilas Yadaim Ish argues fundamentally, and he says it's not true. Your hands don't actually become tar until you pour the second time, unless the first time was Ravias, and then you dry your hands. Therefore, according to the Chazon Ish, if you only poured one time less than Ravias, he disagrees with what's excuse me. He disagrees and he says your hands will not become tar by just drying them. You need to pour a second time after you dry them. Let's say you touch the water that your friend used to wash. Dirshu number 44 quotes the Chazon Ish. It makes your hands tummy. There's no different. The Chazon Ish adds on, says only when your friend washed properly. But if you touch the water that your friend washed not properly, there was chatzitza, you only wash part of it, and then it will not become tummy. And therefore, now we have the $1 million question. Everyone was probably wondering, a wet towel. A wet towel is wet from what? It's wet from someone else washing their hands. Very wet towel, so there's mamish water there. So if you dry your hands in it, which you really are making them some level wet, what happens? Says the Chazon Ish, you do not have to be worried. Excuse me, says the Chazon Ish, right? Kiv shem lo not like a din, ela mayim elo din min netila shem tamim. B'sayin zeh kmo shkoz machsa shekel shishzosh lo likanech b'mav shekinach b'chaver shem v'chaver lo not like a din. But says the Chazon Ish, you do not have to be worried. Meaning, let's just explain what the Chazon Ish is, that the Chazon Ish is doing some math over here. And he's saying that, wait, we just said that if you only wash one time, the water is tameh, you dry it on a wall, your head, whatever it is, that water is tameh. Someone else touches it, what's going to happen? It makes him tameh. So ask the Chazon Ish 1 second. So if Ruvain washes his hands, and he didn't wash properly, so now the water is still tameh. Now when he dries his hands, the water in the towel is tameh. I go and I wash properly, but I touch that towel, I should make my hands tameh. Says the Chazon Ish, we do not have to be worried, you don't have to be concerned about that. Even though the Machzas Shekel seems to be concerned. On the other hand, says the Shevet Levi goes with the Machzas Shekel, and he says if you're in a public area and here with a lot of people, Vadai Sheishab Kelu Shlo, there's certainly people who are not washing properly, and therefore says the Shevet Levi, you're not allowed to use the wet towel. It's another reason you're in the shtibel and they got those, ichi towels. Now you know you don't not use it because of germs. You don't use it because of the Shevet Levi's chumrah in Netilas Yadaim. But he adds on, if it's a towel that's not for the public, 1 or 2 people, then you don't have to be worried about it, and you can assume that people know what they are doing. And finally, Dirshu number 45 discusses that only if you do a deep scrub in your head does it make your hands tameh. If you touch your head, we've learned prior that even though your yad and the roish and the guf, this brings us all the way back to Siman base, are all considered one guf, are you allowed to cover your head with your hand? Says, we're quoting over there Siman base, that there are mekilim, if one has nothing else to cover his hand, to make a bracha. And with that we will stop, and we'll pick it up from Siman Sif Tes, in the next year, B'siyata Dishmaya.